Hi, I'm Kati Brandenburg, and welcome to Full Disclosure with the District Attorney. We're going to have a pretty informal topic, but I think very interesting, with a retired Chief Deputy District Attorney, Gary Cade, in the Second Judicial District, and he retired about a year ago, in December. And then we have Mark Drebbing, who's a Chief Deputy District Attorney, and he is retiring this December. There aren't any personality issues, or we're getting along, right? You're just looking forward to a different life. But I thought it would be really interesting to have you all talk about some of the changes in the district attorney's offices. You've worked, and I know, Gary, you've worked in a number of them in different jurisdictions. Mark, you've worked under a number of different administrations, and talk about how they've changed over the 25 years that you've worked in them, and just how our community's changed and things like that. So what stands out in your mind, Gary? I'll throw the first one at you.
One of the things that occurred to me when you asked me to appear was how technology has changed in how we process cases, how the court processes cases, how the police department processes cases. Okay. As an example, when I started in 1984 in San Juan County in Farmington, when we went to look for priors, it was literally on 3x5 cards, and then you would go from the courthouse to the archives to look for proof of prior convictions. Now, of course, everything's done electronically and in a digital format. I think one of the things that's happened is the police are now transmitting reports electronically. Certainly that had never happened before. When I started, we typed things as opposed to using word processing. So I think the technology has gone a long way into what I hope is making things more efficient and more better.
Okay, Mark, do you agree with that?
Yes, when I started, and I actually started a few years later in 1988 at the DA's office here. And at the time, the big advancement was the IBM Selectric typewriter with the little ball on it. And if you made your mistakes, you had to use whiteout. Everything was, there was no such thing initially with us using computers, and there was a lot done handwritten as well as with the typewriters. And over the years, things have advanced quite a bit. Now with trials, we're using PowerPoint, we're using big TV screens. Everybody has laptops or iPads or some type of a device. And it makes things a lot easier and a lot faster.
It helps us manage things. But one of the things that I miss is in the olden days, people used to talk more. We had more of a trust with each other because we had more of that personal contact. And it seems like everything's email and it's documented, and that's great. But I miss, you could do deals on a handshake if it was in everyone's best interest, including the communities. And things are so formalized and so computerized and high-tech that we seem to have lost that personal touch.
I agree, and even when you're negotiating a case now, a lot's done over email. If you may not know the attorney well, and it does, I think it hurts the case, especially where we have no contact with the defendant, and in terms of what the needs are, what the defense attorney is working with, everything's over the computer.
Yeah, and there's some good things, and there's some downsides to that.
It's made it faster. One of the things in the old days, this 25 years ago counts as the old days.
It's the old days.
When you would mail a formal plea offer, which we now do by emails, there would be the 3-day mailing going out. And typically there would be a phone call confirming, but until you had the documents in hand. So basically the process would take about a week. Now it's done within the hour.
But one of the things that's odd about that is cases back then were resolved much quicker than they are now. So with this technology and with the faster communication, our cases are pending a lot longer than they used to be. It takes about a year to 2 years to almost get any case to trial. 25 years ago, you could almost get any case to trial, including some homicide cases, within 6 months. But I think that's part of the volume and the limited resources that we're all dealing with.
I agree. When I started as a chief deputy in the office about 10 years ago, my best recollection is the Albuquerque Police Department had in the neighborhood of 700, 750 sworn officers. Before I left, they were at 1,100. Right. So there was a 50% increase, roughly, in the police department. I think the sheriff's office more or less the same. And so the volume has dramatically increased. part of that is because the population
Right.
has increased. There are more people, they're committing more crimes. And so there's just this significant increase. I've seen studies that the district court, as an example, should have 3 to 5 more judges. The number of judges went up about 50%, but they're still behind. The prosecutor's office is behind.
Right.
The public defender's office is behind. All from the volume, part of which is generated by population and increased numbers of officers investigating, presenting cases.
Let's talk about something that's near and dear to my heart, and because I spend so much time involved in it, and that's the media. The media, and my dad was DA in the 70s, and I've had many conversations with him. The media has changed, and it's changing almost on a year-by-year basis. Things are happening so quickly. But it seems like back in the 70s and the 80s, and maybe even the 90s, they used to report the news. And we all understood that, and they understood that, and everything was fine. Now, in my opinion, it seems like they're making the news, they're creating the news stories, and because the business is so competitive, they're sensationalizing to some degree, just so that they can keep their heads above water. What are your opinions on that?
Well, I think some of it's a product of the economy,
Right.
because they're competing with other news media to try and get the story out first, to get the best story. As it relates to our office, I think our office has come into a lot more scrutiny of how we are handling cases, and so it's not necessarily reporting on the crime, but how things are being handled within the office. And I think over the years that's kind of developed, that our office gets attacked on how things are perceived by the public and how we are addressing the cases.
Actually, I mean, I would say it's the whole system. I think judges get attacked. I think the police department gets attacked. I think everybody gets attacked if it makes for a better story.
And it's been a while since I've seen something positive for
Right.
the police department, for the DA's office, or for the courts, where it's just a feel-good story that this
Right.
is being done for the community.
It's being done right. And I think that that's one of the problems that we deal with is our employees have low morale, they're exhausted, and they can put in a 20-hour day, and anything good they do isn't going to be recognized by anyone outside the office, and anything bad they do, no matter how minor it is going to be on the 10 o'clock news. Gary, you've got a unique perspective because you used to work in the media.
I did. I was a television reporter in Albuquerque in the early and middle 70s. And when I started, we did everything on film. The motion picture film, I can recall, at a certain point, we simply could not cover it because we didn't have time to process the film. And television is a visual medium. Now it's done electronically, so you have virtually live transmissions from anywhere in the world with satellites. One of the things that's happened, I think, is between television and newspapers, which still relies predominantly on an old technology, are in competition with folks in social media, with cell phones that tweet things, with blogs. And so there is an increasing competition to get the news out first. There used to be talk about overnight news cycle. Remember the late Governor Cargo telling me if he held a press conference on Friday, it would still be reported on Monday in radio stations on the east side. Now with the immediacy of electronic communication mechanisms, it's done virtually automatically. And so what I will call the traditional media, the TV stations, the newspapers, are all in this competition to try and get it out first. And if they can't be first, to find a different spin. They're in a struggle for audience. We've lost a daily newspaper in Albuquerque. There are certainly more television stations that people can access, whether it's the Spanish language station or Fox or whoever it is, all of which are competing for viewers. So there's this competition that I think is breeding an unhealthy attitude towards stories. You don't get the time to reflect on them. The editors don't get time to fact check, those kinds of things, because they're struggling to get it out first so they don't lose the competitive race.
Do you think it's impacted the district attorney's office and our ability to do our job?
My personal opinion is that there is an impact because the focus is increasingly, in my judgment, on law and order, on police kinds of issues, because they're simple. Somebody did something bad to someone suffered. So there is this battle between good and evil, and they're not looking. There's an increased focus on the prosecutor's office, and as Mark noted and you noted, the focus is on the bad things and not on the positive things. Walter Cronkite once said, you know, yesterday there were 140,000 airplanes took off and landed safely, but the focus was on the one that crashed. The focus in our business is on the mistakes we make, and we have made some, but without recognizing all the hard work that goes in.
And in fairness to the media, we've learned by the mistakes that we've made that they've caught, that we might not have caught because of the volume of cases. We handle anywhere between 20 and 30,000 cases a year. So when something goes wrong, they might pick up on it, and we learn from that. So I mean, and that's a positive thing. And I think that the media is a good vehicle for us to hold ourselves accountable to the public and have press conferences and inform the public. One of the things I find so frustrating is we're talking about complex issues. I mean, the law is complex, and they want a 5-second soundbite to explain something that's extremely difficult to understand, sometimes even for lawyers. And that's kind of frustrating. That's just the nature of the beast. I don't think that there's any way to deal with that.
Well, and I think that the media actually helps how we handle our cases in a lot of ways, because if you know that it's a high-profile case and you are being watched, you're going to make sure that everything is done to a greater degree, just because you know you're going to have to answer for it. And it's always a big issue when you know that you're going over to court and there are going to be cameras in the courtroom watching everything that you do on a case.
But as DA, I would like to believe that we handle every case like that. I mean, we should kind of pretend that whatever we do is being looked over, and we could be on TV, or whatever happens could be reported in the newspaper, because I think we always do want, you know, the best result. You know, one of the things that I've realized in my lifetime is there's been a change in attitudes about certain crimes. And it's really interesting. We know certain things like DWI, for instance, was we've become much more aware. Most of us know someone that's been injured or killed in a DWI accident, and we're much more sophisticated in our understanding of the impact that it has on our community and on our state. Now, I know that both of you were in Metro Court prosecuting at one time most of the misdemeanor DWI cases. Do you all want to make a comment on that, or the change in our perception of drinking and driving?
I started in Metro Court in 1988 and spent about a year there prosecuting cases. At the time, Metro Court was completely different. There was no such thing as officer prosecuted cases. We prosecuted everything, so DWIs were just another type of crime that we prepared to prosecute. And over the years, DWI and domestic violence are the two cases that the DA's office handles in Metro Court. At least from my perspective, what I've seen over the years is there is a big push on both of those types of crimes toward rehabilitation. And it's not just to go out and to punish somebody, it's to try and change behavior, which I think is a good thing.
Okay. And you're talking about the smaller cases. I mean, the typical DWI-1, DWI-2, and they have a drug court in Metropolitan Court that deals with DWI.
Yes.
Now, how about the larger cases that represent, a vehicular homicide? And specifically, I think what really turned the tide in DWIs was the Gordon House case in the early 1990s, where basically a family got wiped out by a person who was later convicted of driving drunk. And I think that we really started recognizing and feeling, wait a minute, this could impact my family. I could lose my family to a drunk driver.
I agree. I think that Nadine Milford put DWI in the public consciousness when her family was killed. My best recollection on a Christmas Eve, which made it even more tragic, if that's possible. And suddenly, although we'd had the same legal standard since the 1930s that someone is guilty of driving DWI if they are impaired to the slightest degree, that the police officers became more sensitive to that issue, the public became more insistent upon prosecutions, and the penalties were changed. There was a virtually complete rewrite of the DWI laws. The vehicular homicide penalties have doubled. When I started, it was 3 years. Now it's 6. Still seems very little for someone who loses their life, but if it's someone who simply made an error in judgment, that's a judge's question. And I appreciate that the legislature has tried to strike a balance between being punitive and having an appropriate deterrent that hopefully people will recognize their problems. But there's no question, I think DWIs are treated differently now than they were when I started.
Yeah, we have the ignition interlock. We've got the DWI impact panel, where they have people that have been victims of DWI or family members come and talk to the class. We have the interlock, which is supposed to be mandatory on all DWI offenders, and so I think we've got a much tougher outlook, and that's one way that the media has really helped us. In you drink, you drive, you lose. I mean, they put on the news stories about really bad cases, and I think that we all take them to heart. They impact all of us. Domestic violence. I think that that's another one where there's been a lot more public awareness, and I think prosecutors are much more tougher today than they used to be in prosecuting those cases.
And I think those are among the toughest cases, especially misdemeanors, where a lot of times you have victims who are recanting, who don't want to show up because you're dealing with a relationship there that the crime, the charge interferes with. And so those are the toughest. Those are traditionally in Metro Court especially, where there's a lot of times not a lot of evidence, and you're having to have, to some degree, combat your own witness who may not want to be there.
Right.
And I think that this is a type of crime where we're looking at a circle of violence where if it's something that's happening over and over, you want to change behavior.
And it has a huge impact on children. I mean, we know domestic violence has a huge impact. And I go out into the community and talk to groups, and I say, even if you're not a victim of domestic violence and you don't know anyone who is, we're still all paying the price, because the children that are in the home are going to grow up and be different individuals because of that violence. And we pay it in our tax dollars, and we will continue to pay it.
I also would point out, I think, that domestic violence is one of those crimes that crosses all ethnic,
Right.
all economic, all geographic boundaries. We had prosecuted, during my tenure in the office, people who were legislators, people who were scientists, people who were judges. You know, tragically, we had a retired judge who killed his wife and then shot himself one morning.
Right.
And I think you very accurately pointed out that's the ultimate form of domestic violence. So it's a crime that reaches everyone. And one of the things I think that happened is people have become more willing to report it.
Right.
Where once it was held behind closed doors because people, for family or religious or economic reasons, we've had some people whose spouses have threatened to have them deported, are now feeling some more flexibility reporting. The sad part of that is once it's investigated, many times they try and step back from it because they realize it's going to have some significant impacts on their lives, whether it's economic or whatever, or they're simply embarrassed by it and they try and explain it away. But certainly, again, I think it's one of those crimes that public attitudes are changing about.
Very much so. Drugs. We've been in a declared war against drugs for decades. Have we won that war?
What I've seen over the years is there have been changes on how we address drug cases, but specifically within the community, I think that the drug dealing has become much more organized and more involved, and the police departments have addressed this. It used to be, when I started felony prosecution of drug cases, it would be you catch the drug dealers selling drugs on a street corner. They're no longer on the street corner. They're inside houses now, and they're only selling to people that they know, and trying to find where those drugs are coming from. Because we're a border state, it appears a lot are coming up from Mexico. In terms of the types of drugs, when I started with narcotics prosecutions, marijuana was a much bigger deal, I think, than it is now. The primary narcotic drug that we were seeing was cocaine. I think because of the prescription drug issue, we're seeing heroin, resurgence of heroin cases. And so things have changed. We're also seeing synthetic drugs, methamphetamine, ecstasy, spice is a recent one now that's been in the news, where it's chemically produced. And so there has been a change over time. How we address it, it's still, back when I was starting with this, the drug court program was just getting started. I think that was a good program in terms of addressing the users, the rehabilitation, again, the change of behavior. The traffickers, the office has always gone after aggressively.
Okay. And you know, I think the drugs, they go, you know, heroin was really big in the 70s, and then we had other things, cocaine in the 80s, and then the 90s it was something else, and we're back to heroin, and meth was really big in the late, say around 2008, 2006 to 2008, it was really big. And so they kind of cycle in and out. Spice is really big now, and we're finding more of that now. But I do think that there's been a change in viewpoint of how we deal with that.
At one point, my best recollection is the office estimated 45% of our felony crimes were related to methamphetamine in one way or another. People were buying it, using it, selling it, or making it, distributing it, neglecting their children because of it, stealing to support their habits, or hurting people to support their meth habits. Meth, because of some fairly aggressive prosecution in the office, during your tenure started the Meth Initiative, where we had people that focused across all law enforcement lines, from the police to the post office, has, to my best understanding, ameliorated somewhat. I suspect it's still out there, but meth has come and gone. The rehabilitation efforts of the courts, I think, need to be noted, because the court has recognized there are some people that simply have drug habits and can be saved and do not need to be warehoused in prison. The folks who are serious need to be locked up because of proximity, because of the volume. There's people in our city that are doing business with the Mexican cartels. It's given rise to the gangs, which became more prevalent, I think, in the 90s and the early 2000s, because they could make money selling drugs, and if they needed violence to enforce that, then they did so.
And one of the things, it is much more organized, and sometimes law enforcement has to use wiretaps. That includes state law enforcement as well as the feds. And we have to be more sophisticated. One of the things that really fascinates me is gangs used to compete with each other and not work with each other. And in the last 10 years, we've seen gangs working together and forming partnerships, so to speak, so that they can be successful and make more money being involved with the trafficking of drugs. The DA's office, it's changed hugely over the years. What are some of those changes, Mark?
Okay, well, when I started, I think the office was about 30, 40 attorneys. We're more than double that now. It was less than 100 people. Total staff and attorneys were, I believe, over 300 in the office now. The size of the office impacted how we screen cases, how we prepare cases. We are divisionalized based on the type of a crime. So if it's a gang-related case, it goes to our gang division. If it's a white-collar case, it goes to our white-collar division, and so on. When I started, there was a lot more general prosecution. And these divisions within the office developed based on the need, based on the cases that we got.
Right. And Gary, do you want to add in your 2 cents?
Well, you mentioned that your father was the district attorney in the 70s, and I was reporting at the time. I want to say that at that time they had something in the neighborhood of 10 lawyers, perhaps,
not
10
many,
or 12.
not many.
And that included the district attorney himself. And as Mark says, just handling that number of people, when you're responsible for an operation that's funded $18, $20 million with 300 employees, it takes time away from your leadership or the district attorney's leadership. 3 chief deputies. As one of the chief deputies when I first started, I had what would have been the second largest DA's office in any other, if it had been any other county in the state. So that's changed. The divisioning in the office has changed. The prosecution style is different in Bernalillo County simply because of numbers and because of the volume, where we have a grand jury division that handles all of the felony crimes, screens the cases, makes a determination whether it should be prosecuted, if so, presents it to the grand jury, and then hands it off to whichever unit is appropriate, whether it's violent crimes, crimes against children, and so on.
I think that it's interesting, but back in the day, we had a grand jury sitting 1 day a week. Now we have 3 grand juries, and they sit for a total of 6 days a week. And we have some days where we have 2 grand juries sitting, and that in and of itself is pretty amazing. How about are we doing justice? I mean, that's really a broad question. But because of all of these changes and the world has changed, are we able to do justice dealing with the volume that we have? I think we're operating at about 69% of what we really need to do the job that we're doing.
I think we are. In terms of the volume that we've handled, though, because it's increased so much, there's always going to be a need for more people. How we address the cases, I don't think has changed a lot. We still approach them with the same integrity, the same review. But we had talked about the number of trials has decreased over time, but I think that can be attributed to the volume of cases too. If you have a serious case go to trial, it ties up an entire week or more, and those cases that could be resolved during that time period get put aside. So there's a big competition with us, the defense, and the courts to try and keep the cases moving, but they keep coming in.
Right. And I think there's a kind of everybody's tired, everybody's overwhelmed, and it's really difficult to keep pushing and pushing and pushing where you don't ever see a light at the end of the tunnel, and you're never going to if you're working in the office. That's one of the good things, and that's one of the frustrating things.
One of the things that I guess I would point out is that there seems to be some transitory people in the district attorney's office because of the workload, because of the pay. They come, they get some experience, and then they move on. And that's unfortunately may have some effect on the justice that is pursued by the office. Are we getting justice? In my opinion, yes. Other people may disagree. If they're the victim, if they're the offender, if they're just a stakeholder, one of the other stakeholders is what my view of justice is and theirs. But if we had more people and we could hang on to them longer, I think we could do better work.
And that's one of the problems.
Or come closer to the ideals.
We are the largest law firm in the state of New Mexico. And we get young attorneys who have educational loans, they want to start families, they come into the office, and we're one of the lowest paid state attorney, the attorneys in our office, and it's really hard to keep them. So they come, they get a lot of experience, there's a lot of promise, we spend a lot of time and effort in training them, and then they have to feed their kids, or they want to buy a home, or they need to pay off their educational loans, and they'll leave state employment and go into the private sector, or even go work for another state agency that can pay more.
We've had a number of people, I think, go from the office to become judges, which is to me an indication that they were quality people and had huge pay raises.
Oh, huge.
50% or more, switching from being in front of the bench to being behind it.
You've each got about 15 seconds to close. Are you optimistic about the criminal justice system? Do you think it will continue to work as well in the future as it has in the past? And 15 seconds would hold you to it.
Okay. Well, I am optimistic, and just some of the things that I'm retiring at the end of the year, some of the things that I will leave behind that have started deal with what we started with talking about technology. And in terms of trying to push forward with everything, receiving reports, recordings, photos, everything electronically, and trying to streamline how we handle cases.
Okay. Gary?
Again, I guess I would point to the technology where we started. The new generation is better at that than I ever was or ever will be. They're good at it. They're dedicated. They will work hard. We always think things were tougher when we were there, but I don't know that that's true, and I'm sure they will do well.
Well, thank you all both for your, lifetime, your careers of service. I really appreciate it. I'm Kati Brandenburg, 2nd Judicial District Attorney. Thank you for joining us. I am working on your behalf.